My name is William Harrison. I am 70 years old, and I spent my entire life building Harrison real estate and logistics from a single rented desk into an empire right here in Chicago. I gave everything to my family. I built a fortress of wealth so my son would never know the struggles I faced. But if you are listening to this right now, I want you to pay close attention. Sometimes the people you build the fortress for are the exact same ones who will lock the gates and set the walls on fire with you still inside. The grand ballroom of the Chicago Drake Hotel was practically vibrating with the hum of 300 elite guests. It was my 70th birthday gala. The chandeliers cast a golden glow over the shareholders, politicians, and friends I had known for decades. The champagne flowed, the jazz band played softly in the background, and everything looked like a picture of absolute perfection. Then my daughter-in-law, Monica, stepped up to the microphone. She tapped her crystal flute with a silver spoon. The room quieted down, turning their expectant faces toward the radiant, beautiful woman in the designer gown I had paid for. She smiled, a tight, sorrowful smile dabbing at the corner of her eye with a tissue. She cleared her throat and spoke with a trembling voice that was nothing but a masterful performance. She looked out at the crowd and announced that my mind was rapidly declining. She spun a tragic tale of my failing memory, painting a picture of an old, senile man who could no longer care for himself. And then, with a look of mock pity directed right at me, she delivered the final blow. She told the room that her and my son Derek's birthday gift to me was an indefinite, peaceful retirement at a specialized care facility. She was effectively declaring a corporate and medical takeover right in front of the city's elite. I slowly turned my head to look at my son. Derek sat right beside her, his shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed firmly on the toes of his expensive leather shoes. He did not say a word. He did not defend me. He simply let his wife publicly execute my independence. I did not shout. I did not cry. I calmly pushed my chair back and stood up. The room was so silent you could hear a pin drop. I walked with slow, deliberate steps toward the center of the head table. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small, heavy red velvet box. I placed it on the cool marble surface and quietly slid it across the table until it gently bumped against the base of Monica's champagne flute. Monica looked down at the box, her fake smile faltering just a fraction. She reached out with perfectly manicured fingers and popped the lid open. I watched the exact moment her soul left her body. All the color drained from her face. Her jaw went completely slack. The crystal glass slipped from her trembling fingers and shattered into 100 pieces on the marble floor. The entire room went dead silent. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. It means a lot to me to know who is listening and where you are tuning in from. To understand why that tiny red box was her absolute death sentence, you have to rewind exactly 3 months to a quiet Tuesday afternoon. It was supposed to be a relaxing week. I had gone up to a private resort in Wisconsin for a brief golf trip with some old colleagues. But the weather had turned unseasonably cold, and a lingering ache in my lower back made me decide to cut the trip short by a day. I did not bother calling Derek or Monica to let them know I was coming back. I figured there was no need to disturb them. After all, they lived in the magnificent $4 million estate in Lincoln Park that I had purchased for them entirely in cash as a wedding gift. I lived in the sprawling guest wing of that same estate, an arrangement they had insisted upon after my wife passed away. They told me they wanted me close, that they wanted to care for me in my twilight years. I had believed every single word. I pulled my car into the long, winding driveway of the estate just past 2 in the afternoon. The neighborhood was completely silent, the kind of absolute quiet that only exists in extremely wealthy suburbs. I grabbed my overnight bag from the trunk and let myself in through the side entrance, moving quietly so as not to track dirt onto the imported hardwood floors Monica loved so much. The house felt empty. The massive crystal chandelier in the foyer, hung completely still. I walked softly down the wide corridor that led toward my wing of the house, enjoying the peacefulness of the afternoon. But as I approached the heavy oak doors of the home office, I heard a voice. It was Monica. The door was cracked open just a few inches, bleeding a sliver of warm light into the shadowed hallway. I was about to push the door open and announce my arrival to tell her about the terrible weather on the golf course, when the sharp, vicious tone of her voice made me freeze in my tracks. She was not speaking with the sweet melodic cadence she always used around me. Her voice was an ugly, urgent hiss, practically vibrating with venom. She was pacing back and forth, talking to someone on her cell phone. I stood there in the hallway, my hand hovering just inches from the brass doorknob. The words that came out of her mouth next hit me with the force of a freight train. She said the old man just passed his annual physical. I saw the medical report on his desk. His heart is strong. His blood work is perfect. Do you understand what this means? He could live another 15 years. We absolutely cannot wait that long. My breath caught in my throat. I stood paralyzed, listening to the woman I treated like my own daughter speak about my lifespan, as if it were a massive inconvenience, a rotting obstacle standing in her way. I pressed my back against the cold wall of the corridor, unable to tear myself away from the horrifying realities folding on the other side of that door. There was a brief pause as she listened to whoever was on the other end of the line. Then she let out a frustrated, cynical laugh. "I do not care what the risks are," she snapped, her voice dropping to a sinister whisper. "Up the dosage in his morning coffee starting tomorrow. I want him confused. I want him disoriented. He needs to be declared medically incompetent before his 70th birthday next month, or the terms of the trust fund will lock us out completely. If he signs the new corporate restructuring documents while he is still legally of sound mind, we lose our access to the operational accounts. We need him gone, mentally gone, before the party." I felt the blood rush out of my head. The hallway began to spin. Up the dosage in his morning coffee. The words echoed in my mind over and over, bouncing against the walls of my skull until they formed a terrifying picture. For the past month, I had been experiencing strange spells of extreme fatigue. There were mornings when I could barely focus on the financial reports sitting right in front of me. There were afternoons where my vision blurred and my memory seemed to slip through my fingers like water. I had chalked it up to stress, to old age, to the natural decline of a 70-year-old body. But every single morning without fail, Monica had brought me a steaming cup of dark roast espresso. She would smile her radiant, perfect smile, tell me how much she loved me, and insist I drink every drop to start my day right. She had even shooed away the housekeeper, claiming she wanted to prepare my breakfast herself because it made her feel like a true daughter taking care of her father. She was not taking care of me. She was poisoning me. The realization hit me so hard, my knees actually buckled. I was standing in a $4 million mansion that I had paid for with the sweat and sacrifice of 40 years of grueling work. I was providing these people with a life of absolute, unbridled luxury. I had paved their world in gold, and in return, the woman my son chose to marry was methodically dosing my morning coffee with chemicals designed to destroy my brain. She was deliberately trying to simulate severe dementia so she could steal the keys to my empire and lock me away in a facility. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I needed to get away from that door. I needed to retreat to my room, process this horrific information, and plan my next move. I slowly shifted my weight, intending to step backward into the shadows of the corridor. But as I moved my right foot, I stepped squarely onto the edge of a loose floorboard. A loud, sharp creak echoed through the silent hallway like a gunshot. The voice on the other side of the door stopped instantly. The silence that fell over the house was so absolute, so heavy, it felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. I froze, holding my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The sliver of light spilling from the office widened as the heavy oak door was slowly pulled open. Monica stood in the doorway. She was dressed in pristine white designer slacks and a silk blouse, the very picture of elegance and grace. But the look on her face was one of absolute unfiltered terror. Her phone was still clutched tightly in her hand, pressed against her chest. She stared at me standing there in the hallway with my overnight bag completely unannounced. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. I saw the ruthless, calculating predator staring back at me. I saw the panic of a criminal who realized she might have just been caught in the act of orchestrating a horrific crime. We locked eyes, and in that agonizingly long second, I knew that the battle for my life, my sanity, and my legacy had just begun. The silence hung between us in the hallway, thick and entirely suffocating. Monica stared at me, her chest heaving slightly under her pristine white silk blouse. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the grand arched window behind her, casting a warm glow that felt completely at odds with the freezing dread pooling in my stomach. I could see the rapid calculations flashing behind her perfectly made-up eyes. For a fraction of a second, she was nothing but a cornered animal caught in the glare of headlights. Her knuckles were bone white where she gripped the edge of the heavy oak door, serving as a physical barrier to whatever secrets lay inside the home office. I stood perfectly still. My overnight bag hung heavily from my shoulder, and I made sure that my posture remained relaxed. I gave her absolutely nothing to read on my face. I needed to see exactly how she would play this terrible hand. I needed to witness just how deep the rot went within the walls of my own home. And then, I witnessed something that chilled my blood even more profoundly than the sinister words I had just overheard. I watched her completely transform right before my eyes. The sheer panic melted away from her features, instantly replaced by a mask of radiant, loving concern. It was a flawless physiological shift. Her tense, raised shoulders dropped in a perfectly timed sigh of relief. The cold, calculating stare softened into the warm, affectionate gaze she had perfected over the past 5 years since marrying my son. It was an absolute masterclass in deception. If I had not distinctly heard her voice vibrating with lethal venom just moments before, if I had not heard her explicitly command someone to drug my coffee, I would have wholeheartedly believed the loving smile now spreading across her beautiful face. She let out a soft, breathless laugh, placing a manicured hand over her chest, as if I had simply startled her out of a deep daydream. The audacity required to look a man in the eye while plotting his demise was staggering. "Oh, Dad." She breathed, her voice dripping with sweet relief and practiced warmth. "You are home early. You completely surprised me." She stepped out of the office and pulled the heavy door shut behind her with a soft click, effectively blocking my view of the mahogany desk and the financial documents she had undoubtedly been scrutinizing. She walked toward me with her arms outstretched and wrapped me in a gentle embrace. The scent of her expensive floral perfume hit my senses, and it took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to physically push her away in disgust. I forced myself to stand entirely still, to lift my arms and pat her back gently, playing the part of the weary father returning home from a long, exhausting trip. When she pulled back, she looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes that betrayed zero guilt. "I am so sorry if I sounded loud just now," she said, her tone perfectly modulated to convey exasperated affection. "I was on the phone with your insurance broker, and I was absolutely furious." She shook her head, letting out a heavy sigh of feigned frustration. "They were trying to double the premium on your life insurance policy just because of that minor blood pressure spike you had last month. Can you believe the nerve of those people?" She reached out and gently squeezed my arm, acting the part of the fierce protector. "I told them they were completely incompetent. You just passed your physical with flying colors. I was not about to let them take advantage of you and drain your accounts. We just want you to relax and enjoy your retirement, Dad. You have worked far too hard building your company to let these corporate vultures stress you out now." The lie was so smooth, so perfectly constructed, that it was truly terrifying to witness. She had taken the factual fragments of the truth, my recent physical exam and my blood pressure reading, and woven them into a brilliant, plausible narrative designed to pacify me. Before I could formulate a response to her breathtaking deceit, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the grand marble staircase behind me. Derek rounded the corner dressed in a casual cashmere sweater, looking down at his phone. He stopped abruptly when he saw us standing together in the corridor. "Dad," he asked, his voice pitching up slightly in genuine surprise. "I thought you were staying up in Wisconsin until tomorrow afternoon." He walked toward us, his eyes darting quickly between Monica and me, desperately searching for emotional cues to understand the situation. Monica did not miss a single beat. She turned to her husband with a completely natural, relaxed smile. "Derek, can you believe the insurance company? I was just telling Dad how I had to yell at that broker on the phone. They are trying to gauge him on his premiums again." I kept my eyes fixed on my son. I watched Derek hesitate for a fraction of a second. I watched his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard. It was the telltale sign of his anxiety, a nervous habit he had possessed since he was a little boy, trying to hide a bad report card. But then, to my profound disappointment, he fell right into step beside his wife. "Oh, right," Derek stammered slightly, slipping his phone into his pocket. "Yeah, it is ridiculous, Dad. Monica has been on the phone with them all morning fighting it. We just want to make sure your estate is protected and that no one is taking your money unnecessarily. You do not need to worry about a single thing. We have got all the boring adult work handled." He let out a nervous chuckle, stepping forward to give me a quick, stiff hug. I looked at my son, my own flesh and blood. He was standing in the magnificent home I bought for him, wearing designer clothes I ultimately paid for, living a life of absolute luxury that I provided through decades of relentless sacrifice. And he was lying right to my face to cover for a woman who was actively planning to chemically destroy my brain. I did not know yet how deeply Derek was involved in the plot. I did not know if he was the mastermind pulling the strings, or if he was just a weak, complicit pawn, too cowardly to stand up to his wife. But looking at his shifting eyes and hearing his nervous laughter, I realized it simply did not matter. He had chosen his side. I knew that if I confronted them right there in the hallway, they would deny everything. They would call me crazy and unstable. They would undoubtedly use my sudden anger as documented proof that my mind was already slipping, accelerating their plan to commit me to a facility. I needed to be significantly smarter than them. I needed to be entirely ruthless. So I dug deep into the very bottom of my soul and pulled out a performance to rival hers. I allowed a warm, deeply grateful smile to spread slowly across my face. I let out a tired, good-natured chuckle and shook my head as if I were profoundly touched by their dedication. "You two work far too hard trying to take care of this old man," I said, keeping my voice gentle, agreeable, and slightly weary. "I appreciate you always looking out for me, Monica. Truly I do. But please do not stress yourselves over these insurance people. Let them send the paperwork in the mail, and I will review it later when I have the energy. For now, I just want to rest my back." Monica's smile brightened, a look of profound relief washing over her delicate features as she believed her lie had been swallowed whole. "Of course, Dad. You go rest in your room. I will bring you a fresh cup of hot coffee in a little while to warm you up." I nodded gratefully, thanking them both again, before turning away. I walked slowly down the long corridor, toward my private wing, keeping my steps measured, deliberate, and slightly heavy. I maintained the absolute facade of the harmless, trusting, aging father until I rounded the corner and stepped into the safety of my own space. The moment the heavy door clicked shut behind me, the warm smile vanished from my face. My breathing deepened into a steady, controlled rhythm. I looked down at my hands. They were not shaking with fear or sadness. They were completely rigid with absolute fury. I slowly curled my right hand into a tight, rock-hard fist until my fingernails dug painfully into my palm. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of deception. They actually thought they were dealing with a clueless, fading old man who would quietly drink his poisoned coffee and fade away into the shadows without a fight. They had absolutely no idea that they had just awakened the very man who had spent 40 years crushing his enemies to build a corporate empire. The lie they told in the hallway was perfectly executed, but it had just triggered a silent war they could not possibly survive. The very next morning began exactly like the dozens of mornings that preceded it. The sunlight streamed through the sheer curtains of my private suite, casting long, elegant shadows across the Persian rug. Right on schedule, at exactly 7:30, a soft knock echoed at my door. Monica glided into the room carrying a silver tray. On it sat a delicate porcelain cup of dark roast espresso, a small crystal glass of sparkling water, and a tiny ceramic dish holding 2 white pills. She wore a perfectly tailored pastel morning gown, her hair tied back in an effortless, elegant sweep. She looked like the absolute embodiment of domestic grace and familial devotion. "Good morning, Dad," she chimed, her voice light and melodic, practically floating through the air. She set the heavy silver tray down on the small mahogany table beside my reading chair. "I hope you slept well. I made sure the beans were ground extra fine this morning, just the way you like them. And do not forget to take your vitamins with your water. We need to keep your heart as strong as possible." I sat up in my chair and offered her a warm, appreciative, tired smile. I reached out and took the porcelain cup, letting the rich, dark aroma of the espresso wash over me. "Thank you, Monica," I replied, keeping my voice raspy and slightly weak, playing the role she had carefully scripted for me. "You are always so good to me. I do not know what I would do without you and Derek looking out for my health." She beamed, leaning down to press a soft, completely hollow kiss against my cheek. "It is my pleasure, Dad. You just rest. Drink your coffee while it is hot." She turned and walked out of the room, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor, closing the heavy door gently behind her. The moment the latch clicked into place, my smile vanished. I looked down at the dark, steaming liquid in my hands. The aroma was strong, but now knowing what I knew, I could almost smell the bitter chemical taint hiding beneath the roasted beans. I carefully set the cup back down on the tray. I walked over to my travel bag, the one I had brought back from Wisconsin the day before, and pulled out a sterile stainless steel thermos. My hands moved with absolute precision. I unscrewed the cap and poured the entire contents of the porcelain cup into the thermos, sealing it tightly. I then walked into the master bathroom, turned on the sink, and rinsed the delicate cup with warm water until it was completely clean. I returned it to the silver tray, making it look as though I had savored every last drop. Next, I turned my attention to the tiny ceramic dish holding the 2 white pills. Monica had told me months ago that these were premium custom compounded daily vitamins, specifically recommended by a concierge nutritionist to help with my energy levels and circulation. I had believed her without a single second of hesitation. Why would a father ever doubt the loving care of his family? I picked up the pills and examined them under the bright light of the reading lamp. They were generic, unmarked white capsules, completely devoid of any identifying numbers or brand stamps. I walked back to my travel bag and retrieved a small plastic container of standard multivitamin capsules I had purchased at a pharmacy on my drive back from the golf resort. They were virtually identical in size and shape and color. I placed 2 of my own harmless vitamins into the ceramic dish and carefully wrapped the pills Monica provided in a clean tissue, slipping them deeply into the pocket of my trousers. For the rest of the morning, I remained in my suite, sitting in the quiet solitude of my room, reflecting on the sheer magnitude of what was happening. For the past 6 weeks, my life had been a terrifying descent into an incomprehensible mental fog. I had been experiencing severe dizziness that made the floor feel like it was tilting beneath my feet. There were afternoons where I would sit at my desk, staring at financial portfolios I had personally managed for decades, entirely unable to make sense of the numbers. My memory, which had always been as sharp as a steel trap, had begun to betray me. I would forget the names of long-standing clients, lose my train of thought mid-sentence, and misplace important documents. I had secretly been terrified. I truly believed that my mind was finally surrendering to the ravages of old age, that I was losing the very intellect that had allowed me to build my empire. I had felt weak, very vulnerable, and deeply dependent on Derek and Monica to help me navigate my suddenly terrifying reality. Now looking at the sterile thermos and the tissue-wrapped pills, the fog was beginning to lift. Over the next 3 days, I continued this exact meticulous routine. Every single morning, Monica would bring me the silver tray. Every single morning, she would watch me with her sweet, predatory smile as I thanked her for her devotion. And every single morning, the moment she left the room, I would empty the tainted coffee into a hidden container and swap her mysterious pills for my safe standard vitamins. I acted the part of the fading patriarch flawlessly. I shuffled my feet when I walked down the hallways. I asked Derek the same questions multiple times during dinner. I deliberately lost my reading glasses and pretended to be confused about what day of the week it was. I fed their arrogant confidence, giving them exactly what they wanted to see. But inside, behind the carefully constructed facade of senility, a miraculous transformation was taking place. By the second day, without the poisoned coffee and pills, the persistent crushing headache that had plagued me for over a month completely dissolved. The heavy suffocating pressure behind my eyes vanished. By the third day, the terrifying mental fog lifted entirely. My thoughts flowed with their usual rapid analytical precision. The dizziness was gone. My memory returned with crystal, absolute clarity. I felt exactly like the man I had always been, the ruthless, highly intelligent founder of Harrison Real Estate and Logistics. I was not losing my mind. I was not succumbing to dementia. I was being systematically, chemically dismantled by the woman living under my roof. On the morning of the 4th day, I knew I needed concrete visual proof. I told Monica and Derek that I was feeling a bit restless and wanted to take a slow, quiet walk through the botanical gardens in the city to get some fresh air. They readily agreed, clearly thrilled to have me out of the house so they could continue plotting their hostile takeover. Derek even offered to call a driver for me, playing the part of the overly concerned son. I declined, stating I wanted to drive myself, playing up my stubborn pride to make the request seem perfectly natural. Once I was behind the steering wheel of my vehicle, I bypassed the botanical gardens entirely. I drove straight to the industrial sector of the city, pulling into the discreet parking lot of a highly specialized independent toxicology laboratory. I had used their services years ago to test soil samples for a massive commercial real estate development, and I knew their discretion was absolutely flawless. I walked into the sterile, brightly lit reception area and asked to speak directly with the head toxicologist. I placed the sealed stainless steel thermos and a small, sterile plastic bag containing 6 of the white pills Monica had given me onto the metal counter. I paid them a massive sum in cash, completely off the books, requesting a rapid, comprehensive chemical analysis of both the liquid and the capsules. The technician promised me results within 48 hours. I returned home playing the part of the exhausted old man who had walked a little too far and retreated to my room. The next 2 days were an agonizing test of my patience. I continued the charade, enduring family dinners where Derek and Monica treated me like a fragile, simple-minded child. I swallowed my absolute rage and smiled blankly as they patronized me constantly. Finally, on Thursday afternoon, my private, secured mobile phone vibrated with a message from the laboratory. The results were ready. I drove back to the industrial district, my hands gripping the steering wheel. When I entered the consultation room, the head toxicologist looked at me with grave concern. He slid a detailed printed report across the table. The white capsules were massive doses of dangerous antipsychotics. The coffee was laced with neurotoxins specifically designed to mimic the severe symptoms of dementia. She was not just incredibly greedy. She was actively, deliberately, and systematically poisoning me every single day right now. The printed toxicologist report rested inside the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. It felt as heavy as a slab of solid lead pressing directly against my ribs. I steered my vehicle through the bustling morning traffic of downtown Chicago. My mind was operating with a cold, terrifying clarity that I had not experienced in over a month. The chemical fog that Monica had so carefully cultivated within my brain had completely evaporated. It left behind nothing but a razor-sharp focus and a mounting glacial fury. I pulled into the underground parking garage beneath the towering glass and steel skyscraper that housed the corporate headquarters of Harrison Real Estate and Logistics. I had spent 4 decades of my life building this company from a single rented desk into an industry titan. Every brick, every contract, every successful merger was a testament to my personal sacrifice. Now I needed to see exactly how deep the infection had spread into my professional empire. I remembered the days when Derek was just a boy sitting in the passenger seat of my old sedan as we drove past construction sites. I used to point to the rising steel frameworks and tell him that one day all of this would belong to him. I had worked 80-hour weeks, missing holidays and school plays entirely to secure his future. I had handed him a golden key to a kingdom he never had to fight for, and now he was using that very key to lock me out of my own life. I stepped onto the private executive elevator and pressed the button for the 42nd floor. The smooth, silent ascent gave me a crucial moment to compose my features. I needed to maintain the facade of the frail, disoriented patriarch. I could not let them know that my mind was fully restored. The elevator chimed softly, and the polished metal doors parted. I stepped out onto the plush carpet of the executive reception area. I expected to be greeted by the warm, familiar voice of Barbara. Barbara had been my personal executive assistant for 25 years. She was a fiercely loyal, brilliantly organized woman who knew the inner workings of my company better than the board of directors. But the reception desk was completely silent. I walked around the marble partition and stopped dead in my tracks. Barbara was not typing furiously at her keyboard or answering the multi-line phone system. Instead, she was standing over a brown cardboard box. Her shoulders were shaking violently as tears streamed down her cheeks. She was wrapping a small framed photograph of her grandchildren in tissue paper. She dropped it into the box alongside her favorite coffee mug and her decades of accumulated desk supplies. My heart sank instantly. I hurried over to her, completely dropping my confused act for a brief moment. I asked her what on earth was happening. Barbara looked up at me. Her face was pale, and her eyes were red from crying. She quickly wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand, looking terrified to even speak. She told me that Derek had marched into the reception area just an hour ago and terminated her employment effective immediately. He had not offered a severance package or a respectful explanation. He only gave a cruel dismissal, stating that the company was pivoting to a modern digital infrastructure. He told her she was a relic of the past, who simply did not fit the new corporate culture. The sheer, unadulterated disrespect of the act made the blood roar in my ears. Derek had fired my most trusted confidant without a single word of consultation. He was actively isolating me from my primary source of corporate information. I reached out and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. I spoke in a low, firm whisper, assuring her that she would not be abandoned. I promised her that her severance would be fully funded from my private accounts. I told her to go home and wait for my call. As she picked up her box and walked toward the elevator, I forced my posture to slump. I let my shoulders round and allowed a vacant, tired expression to wash over my face. The performance had to continue. I turned away from her empty desk and slowly shuffled toward the heavy double doors of the main executive suite. Derek had essentially commandeered my primary office during my supposed mental decline. He relegated me to a secondary space down the hall. Sitting in the sleek, modern waiting chair right outside his door was a man I had never seen before in my life. He appeared to be in his late 30s. He wore a sharply tailored, aggressively expensive Italian suit. His dark hair was slicked back, and a condescending, greasy smirk was permanently etched into his features. He was casually scrolling through a tablet, looking entirely too comfortable on my executive floor. He did not bother to stand or introduce himself as I approached. He simply glanced up from his screen and looked me up and down. His eyes lingered on my slightly disheveled appearance. "Can I help you, buddy?" he asked. His tone dripped with absolute arrogance. "Are you lost?" I stared at him. I forced my hands to tremble slightly as I gripped my leather briefcase. "I am William Harrison," I replied. I made my voice sound thin and slightly confused. "This is my company. Who exactly are you?" The man let out a short, highly amused chuckle. He shook his head as if he were dealing with a toddler. "Right, the famous patriarch. Monica warned me you might wander in here confused today. I am Trevor. I am Monica's cousin from out of state. Derek just brought me on board as the new lead financial consultant to streamline the asset management portfolios." Monica's cousin. The lie was so spectacularly transparent it was actually insulting. I had paid for Monica's entire wedding, and I knew her family tree inside and out. There was no cousin named Trevor. This man was a hostile operative placed directly outside the seat of power to guard the gates. Trevor's presence was a glaring anomaly. My company had a strict, rigorous vetting process for any external financial consultants. We utilized top-tier corporate firms, not slick independent operators with fake familial ties. The fact that Derek had bypassed the board of directors and completely ignored human resources protocols to install this man directly outside my office spoke volumes. It confirmed that Derek was either astonishingly naive or entirely complicit in the theft. Before I could ask another question, the door to the office swung open. Derek stepped out holding a stack of files. When he saw me standing there, a flash of genuine annoyance crossed his face. It was quickly masked by a patronizing smile. "Dad," he asked, sighing heavily, "what are you doing down here in the city? You are supposed to be resting at the house. Your blood pressure has been completely unstable lately." He stepped forward and firmly grabbed my elbow. He physically ushered me into the office and shut the door in Trevor's face. The room was in a state of absolute chaos. Filing cabinets were thrown open and financial ledgers were scattered across the leather sofas. Derek guided me toward a guest chair and practically pushed me into it. "I just wanted to come see how the transition was going," I mumbled. I stared blankly at the floor, perfectly playing the role of the heavily medicated senior citizen. I was looking for Barbara, but I could not find her. Derek rolled his eyes. He walked behind his massive mahogany desk. "Barbara retired this morning, Dad. We talked about this yesterday, remember? You agreed that she was getting too old to handle the new software. It is perfectly fine that you forgot. Your memory is just slipping a bit today. Trevor is here to help me modernize our outdated accounting systems. You do not need to worry your tired head about any of this. Just go hit the golf course, Dad. We have got all the adult work handled right here." The phrase adult work hit me like a physical strike. The sheer audacity of this boy. He was standing in the office I built using the company I founded, telling me to go play, while he actively destroyed my legacy. I slumped deeper into the leather chair. I let my chin drop toward my chest, acting as though the short walk from the elevator had completely drained the last reserves of my physical energy. Derek turned his back to me. He walked over to the small wet bar in the corner of the office to pour himself a glass of sparkling water. He clearly believed that I was entirely harmless. He thought I was completely checked out of reality. In that brief window of opportunity, my eyes darted across the surface of his cluttered mahogany desk. Sitting in plain sight, just inches from my trembling hands, was a stack of freshly printed, highly confidential corporate invoices. My vision was perfectly clear. I read the top sheets with lightning speed. I memorized the figures and the routing numbers. They were authorizing massive immediate wire transfers directly from our primary operational liquidity fund. 3 separate transactions totaling just over $12 million were being actively funneled out of the company. The descriptions on the invoices were incredibly vague. They were categorized entirely as overseas strategic consulting fees and international logistical acquisitions. The receiving accounts were directed to a completely untraceable corporate entity registered in the Bahamas. $12 million. It was a staggering sum of money to move in a single afternoon. In a legitimate business environment, a transfer of that magnitude would require multiple layers of executive authorization, comprehensive board reviews, and extensive legal documentation. Yet here it was casually sitting on my son's desk, disguised behind generic corporate jargon. They were moving incredibly fast. They knew my 70th birthday was rapidly approaching, and they were stripping the company down to its copper wire before the trust fund provisions locked them out. There were no logistical acquisitions. There was no strategic consulting. They were simply bleeding the operational fund dry. Derek was blindly signing off on the systematic looting of my empire. It was orchestrated entirely by Monica and her mysterious financial consultant cousin. Derek turned back around, holding a glass of water. He held it out to me with a look of profound, patronizing pity. "Here, drink this, Dad. You look completely exhausted. Let me have the driver take you back to the Lincoln Park house so you can take a nap." I reached out with a shaking hand and took the glass. I deliberately spilled a few drops onto my trousers to complete the illusion. "Thank you, Derek," I whispered. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the floor. "I think you are right. I am just so incredibly tired today. I am sorry for interrupting your important work." I slowly pushed myself up from the chair, leaning heavily on my cane. Derek patted my back. He guided me out of the office and past the smirking face of Trevor in the hallway. I shuffled back to the elevator, my head bowed. I acted exactly like a broken, senile old man who had finally surrendered to the inevitable decay of time. But the absolute moment the polished metal doors of the elevator slid shut, sealing me inside the private cabin, my posture snapped completely straight. My hands stopped shaking. The war had officially escalated from the confines of my home directly into the heart of my empire. I knew exactly what I needed to do next, and it required entirely removing myself from their line of sight. I returned to the Lincoln Park estate later that evening, ensuring my gait remained slow and my expression suitably vacant. The grand house was quiet, the massive windows casting long shadows across the marble floors. I found Derek and Monica in the formal dining room, sharing a bottle of expensive red wine, laughing softly over a plate of catered appetizers. The sight of their domestic tranquility, knowing the absolute poison they were brewing beneath the surface, made my stomach turn. But I played my part. I shuffled into the room, leaning heavily on my cane, and offered them a weak, apologetic smile. I told them I had been thinking about my health, about the sudden bouts of fatigue, and the terrifying moments of confusion. I watched their eyes lock onto me, practically gleaming with suppressed anticipation. I lowered my head and admitted that I was feeling overwhelmed by the pressures of the city and the lingering stress of corporate oversight. I told them I needed a complete reset, a profound separation from my daily routine, to clear my mind and attempt to regain my strength. I announced that I had booked a 3-week entirely off-the-grid salmon fishing trip to a highly remote, isolated lodge in northern Alaska. I specifically emphasized that the lodge had absolutely no cellular reception and no internet access. I told them I wanted to completely disconnect from the world to rest my aging brain. The reaction was instantaneous and deeply sickening. Derek quickly placed his wine glass on the table and rushed to my side, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. He told me it was the best idea I had had in years. He insisted that the company would run perfectly in his capable hands and that my only job was to focus on my recovery. Monica was even more theatrical. She stood up, her eyes wide with manufactured concern, and wrapped her arms around my neck. She told me how brave I was to recognize my own limitations and seek tranquility. She even offered to pack my bags, claiming she wanted to make sure I had all my heavy winter gear and, of course, a fresh supply of my daily vitamins. I thanked her profusely, fighting the urge to flinch at her touch. For the next 2 days, the estate was a flurry of manufactured care. Monica supervised the packing of my thick wool sweaters and waterproof boots. Derek constantly reassured me about the operational stability of the firm. They were practically vibrating with suppressed glee. They believed they had effectively exiled me to a frozen wasteland for nearly a month, giving them an uninterrupted, completely unmonitored window to drain the corporate accounts and finalize the fraudulent medical paperwork. On the morning of my departure, Derek insisted on having the company driver take me to the airport. I hugged them both at the front door, offering a frail, emotional goodbye. I climbed into the back seat of the town car, waving weakly, as the driver pulled away from the tall iron gates of the estate. The drive to the airport was completely silent. I stared out the tinted windows at the passing Chicago skyline, the towering city I had conquered over 4 decades of relentless ambition. I was not leaving it. I was simply sinking into its shadows to prepare my counterstrike. When the sleek town car pulled up to the busy departure terminal at the international airport, a uniformed skycap immediately rushed forward to assist with my heavy luggage. I thanked the company driver, handed him a generous cash tip, and told him to head straight back to the corporate office. I stood on the crowded sidewalk and waited until his red taillights disappeared entirely into the endless stream of airport traffic. Then the frail, confused old man vanished completely. I stood up perfectly straight. I grabbed my wooden cane, not using it for support, but simply carrying it loosely by my side like a blunt instrument. I abandoned the heavy luggage cart with the bewildered skycap, handing him a crisp $100 bill and explicitly telling him to donate the bags and all their contents to a local winter charity. I turned my back on the bright ticketing counters and walked briskly through the automatic sliding glass doors, weaving through the crowded concourse with absolute predatory purpose. I bypassed the long security checkpoints entirely and headed straight for the lower-level transit pickup zone. The subterranean air was thick with exhaust fumes and the chaotic noise of arriving travelers rushing to their destinations. I pulled my secured phone from my coat pocket and sent a single prearranged text message consisting of one solitary letter. Within 60 seconds, a heavily armored, completely black sport utility vehicle with deeply tinted windows pulled up to the concrete curb directly in front of me. The heavy rear door popped open automatically. I stepped inside the immaculate leather interior, and the vehicle instantly accelerated away from the busy terminal, merging seamlessly into the fast, outbound highway traffic. I was now completely untraceable. The professional driver did not speak a single word. We navigated the complex concrete highway systems, circling back toward the dense heart of downtown Chicago, moving swiftly and anonymously through the gray urban grid. I watched the towering steel skyscrapers approach their massive glass facades, reflecting the cold, overcast morning sky. We bypassed the busy commercial financial districts and pulled into a highly secure, private underground parking garage beneath a towering, brutalist residential building. The heavy steel security gates closed behind us, with a resounding metallic thud cutting off the ambient noise of the outside world completely. I exited the vehicle and took a private keycard-operated freight elevator straight up to the top floor. The steel doors slid open to reveal a massive, entirely windowless penthouse apartment. The vast space had been systematically stripped of all its luxury residential furnishings. In their place, a highly sophisticated, militaristic command center had been hastily but perfectly assembled. Long black folding tables dominated the center of the large room, completely covered in high-end digital monitors, tangled thick black cables, and secure server racks humming with raw processing power. The industrial air conditioning was cranked aggressively low to cool the massive amounts of computer equipment, making the air feel sharp and sterile. Waiting for me in the dead center of the room were 2 men. The first was Bradley Foster. Bradley was my personal attorney, a man who possessed a legal mind so relentlessly sharp and utterly ruthless that opposing corporate counsel often settled complex cases out of pure, unadulterated fear. He wore a perfectly tailored dark gray suit, his face a rigid mask of absolute unforgiving focus. Beside him stood Gavin. Gavin was a digital phantom, a brilliant underground cybersecurity expert, who technically did not exist in any public or government database. He was dressed casually, in a simple black hooded sweatshirt, his pale face illuminated entirely by the harsh blue glow of 3 stacked, oversized computer monitors. I walked confidently into the room and tossed my wooden cane onto an empty leather sofa in the corner. Bradley stepped forward, extending a firm, businesslike hand. He did not offer any empty, polite pleasantries. He simply looked me directly in the eye and stated clearly that the secured proxy servers were fully operational and entirely isolated from any external digital tracking. I nodded slowly, feeling the hot adrenaline flood my aging veins, washing away any lingering exhaustion. I turned my attention to Gavin, whose fingers were already flying furiously across his illuminated mechanical keyboard. I looked at the glowing screens, the thick stacks of legal documents neatly arranged by Bradley, and the invisible digital battleground Gavin had masterfully prepared. I took a very deep breath, letting the cold, sterile air of the windowless penthouse fill my lungs completely. The time for pretending was officially over. I stood tall in the center of the war room and gave the final irreversible command to systematically dismantle my own family. The absolute silence in the room was incredibly heavy and filled with dark anticipation. Bradley opened a thick leather binder revealing the initial legal injunctions he had drafted the night before. I stared down at the documents bearing my son's name, feeling a brief, sharp pang of sorrow deep within my chest. I remembered holding him when he was just a helpless infant, promising myself I would protect him from the harsh realities of the world. Now I was forced to unleash those harsh realities upon him. The betrayal stung like a physical wound, but the cold logic of survival easily overpowered the lingering grief. I was no longer a father trying to guide a misguided child. I was a sovereign defending his kingdom against foreign invaders. Gavin tapped a single key, the main monitor flared to life, displaying a live connection prompt. We were completely ready to begin the final operation against them today. Bradley did not waste a single second of our time. He immediately opened his thick leather briefcase and began systematically covering the long folding table with towering stacks of legal documents. He spread out the original founding charters of Harrison Real Estate and Logistics, the highly confidential corporate bylaws, and the dense multi-layered provisions of my personal trust fund. He worked with the cold, silent efficiency of a seasoned surgeon preparing to operate. He highlighted specific clauses with a yellow marker, mapping out the precise legal boundaries we needed to navigate to entirely isolate my assets from my son's desperate grasp. He cross-referenced property deeds and offshore tax regulations, building an impenetrable wall of litigation that would eventually drop on them like a concrete vault. I watched him construct the trap, feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. There was no room for emotional hesitation in this room. We were executing raw, tactical warfare. Across the room, Gavin was moving at a frantic, almost hypnotic pace. He had removed his black hooded sweatshirt, revealing a plain gray t-shirt underneath. He cracked his knuckles, rolled his neck, and turned his absolute focus toward the 3 glowing monitors stacked on his desk. He did not ask me for passwords or security clearance codes. He simply needed the physical address of the Lincoln Park estate and the IP address of the central internet router I had installed for them 3 years ago. I provided him with the details, and he immediately launched his assault. The black screens in front of him rapidly filled with cascading lines of bright green code. Gavin explained his methodology in short, clipped sentences, without ever taking his eyes off the screens. He told me that wealthy people were incredibly predictable. They filled their massive homes with vulnerable smart devices, wireless thermostats, automated security cameras, and voice-activated entertainment systems, completely ignoring the basic principles of network security. He isolated the primary Wi-Fi network of the estate within 10 minutes. From there, he deployed a highly specialized, aggressive malware packet through a vulnerability in their smart refrigerator. It was a digital backdoor that they had unknowingly left wide open. I stood behind him, crossing my arms over my chest, watching the progress bars inch across the monitors. Gavin was establishing a silent, invisible bridge directly into the heart of my own house. Once he had breached the central router, he targeted the cellular devices connected to the local network. He identified the unique media access control addresses for Monica and Derek's mobile phones. With a few rapid keystrokes, he initiated a full, untraceable cloning process. He was systematically copying their text messages, Their encrypted email folders, their geolocation histories, and their private application data, pulling everything down into his secured, heavily encrypted local servers right here in the penthouse. It was an absolute digital harvest. While the phone data was slowly downloading, Gavin immediately pivoted his attention to the corporate infrastructure of my company. He opened a secondary terminal and launched a brute force infiltration against the executive email servers. I gave him the administrative credentials I still possessed, allowing him to bypass the primary external firewalls. He navigated through the corporate directory until he isolated the newly created email address assigned to Trevor, the slick, arrogant financial consultant, currently occupying my executive floor. Trevor believed he was brilliant. He believed he had constructed a flawless financial diversion. But Gavin cut through his basic folder passwords in less than 4 minutes. He accessed Trevor's inbox, his sent messages, and his deleted items folder, resurrecting files that Trevor had foolishly thought were permanently erased. Gavin's fingers flew across the keyboard, isolating keyword searches for wire transfers, offshore accounts, and foreign banking contacts. The sheer volume of data flooding into our secure servers was staggering. Bradley stepped away from his legal documents and walked over to stand beside me. He crossed his arms, staring at the rapidly scrolling lists of intercepted corporate emails. We watched in absolute silence as the true scope of their operation began to materialize on the bright screens. They were moving incredibly fast, clearly panicked by the approaching deadline of my 70th birthday. They had set up a complex web of automated invoice approvals, effectively bypassing the standard corporate auditing protocols I had established decades ago. Derek had granted Trevor sweeping administrative authority over the operational liquidity funds, essentially handing a loaded gun directly to a stranger. Gavin suddenly raised his right hand, signaling for absolute silence. The rhythmic clacking of his mechanical keyboard stopped entirely. He leaned incredibly close to the center monitor, his eyes narrowing in intense concentration. He tapped a specific key, and a small audio equalization window popped up on the bottom right corner of his screen. He reached over and turned a dial on the small black speaker sitting on the edge of his desk. A sharp burst of static crackled loudly through the silent penthouse. I flinched slightly at the sudden noise, stepping closer to the desk. The static quickly faded, replaced by a low ambient hum. Then I heard the highly distinctive, unmistakable sound of a heavy crystal decanter clinking against a glass. I heard the soft, familiar rustle of fabric. I heard the distant, muffled hum of the evening city traffic filtering through a window. Gavin had successfully activated the microphone on Monica's cloned cell phone. He had turned her expensive, heavily guarded device into an active, high-definition listening bug, transmitting live audio directly from the Lincoln Park estate straight into our windowless bunker. The sound quality was chillingly clear. I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock sitting in the formal study of the house. It was the same clock I had purchased for them as an anniversary present 2 years ago. I slowly walked away from the glowing computer monitors and moved toward a small wooden side table in the dark corner of the room. I picked up a heavy crystal glass and reached for the bottle of premium bourbon I had brought with me. I poured a generous measure of the amber liquid, the sound of the splash echoing the sounds transmitting from the speaker. I did not add ice. I wanted the raw, burning bite of the alcohol to anchor me to the present moment. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the warmth spread through my chest, chasing away the cold, sterile chill of the air conditioning. I walked back toward the center of the room and stood in the shadows, perfectly still, gripping the crystal glass in my hand. Then her voice drifted through the speaker. Monica's tone was sharp, arrogant, and entirely devoid of the sweet, caring affection she displayed for me just a few hours earlier. She was speaking directly to Trevor. Her words were perfectly clear, cutting through the silence of the penthouse like a jagged knife. "I am telling you, Trevor, the old man suspects absolutely nothing," she said, letting out a cruel, dismissive laugh. "He came down to the dining room tonight, looking like a lost, medicated zombie. He actually thanked me for taking such good care of him. It was genuinely pathetic to watch. He is completely slipping away. The new dosage is working perfectly. We just need to maintain this trajectory for 3 more weeks until the birthday gala." Once he collapses in front of the entire board of directors, the medical power of attorney will be entirely undisputed. Trevor's voice responded smooth and dripping with slick confidence. He sounded incredibly relaxed, likely sitting on the very leather sofa I had paid for. The offshore accounts in the Bahamas are fully primed, Monica. Derek signed the last batch of consulting invoices this afternoon without even glancing at the routing numbers. He is so terrified of you leaking that hit-and-run footage that he will sign literally anything we put in front of him. We will have $12 million cleanly washed and transferred by next Friday. As soon as the judge signs the commitment order for the old man, we trigger the final operational drain, empty the primary trust, and we are gone. Derek can take the fall for the corporate embezzlement. He is too weak to defend himself anyway. I stood in the darkness of the penthouse listening to the intricate, deeply horrifying details of my own absolute destruction being casually discussed over evening drinks. I listened to them mock my intelligence. I listened to them celebrate my impending chemical lobotomy. I listened to them orchestrate the financial ruin of my son, the very boy I had spent 40 years trying to protect. I took another long, slow sip of the burning bourbon. I did not feel sorrow. I did not feel a single ounce of paternal hesitation. The man who had walked into that home office yesterday, hoping for a simple misunderstanding, was completely dead and gone. In his place stood a man who was entirely prepared to burn everything to the ground to ensure these parasites did not survive the fire. I looked at Bradley and Gavin. They stared back at me, waiting for my final command. The trap was perfectly set. The bait was taken. It was officially time to close the jaws. The glass of bourbon felt heavy in my hand. Through the digital feed, the sounds of my home broadcasted with absolute clarity. I heard a crystal decanter clinking against glass as Monica poured another round of drinks. Trevor sighed. Gavin adjusted a slider on his monitor, filtering out the background noise of the street. The voices became crisp and immediate. "We must ensure the accounts in the Cayman Islands are insulated," Monica stated, her voice tight with anticipation. "Once the $12 million clear the international wire protocols tomorrow morning, we cannot afford any bounce-backs. The corporate operational fund will be empty. If anyone in accounting notices the deficit before the old man is legally committed, it could trigger an internal audit." Trevor laughed. "Relax, Monica," he said smoothly. "I spread the $12 million across 14 dummy corporations before routing it offshore. The paper trail is a complete labyrinth. Even if their accountants look at the ledgers, all they will see are approved logistical acquisitions and overseas consulting fees. The money is gone. It is secure." We bled the operational liquidity dry right under his nose, and the brilliant William Harrison just sat there staring at his shoes like a medicated ghost. He apologized for interrupting my work. I felt my fingernails dig into my palm. $12 million. It was a massive sum representing years of relentless corporate strategy and decades of building trust with clients. They spoke about it as if they had found a loose coin on the sidewalk. They were dismantling my life's work over cocktails. The heavy oak door of the formal study creaked open. The sharp sound of heavy footsteps echoed across the hardwood floor. My heart caught in my throat. I recognized that uneven stride anywhere. It was Derek. For a fleeting fraction of a second, the dying embers of my paternal hope flared up. I prayed that my son was about to walk into that room and demand answers. I wanted to hear him yell at Trevor to get out. I wanted to hear him realize that Monica was manipulating the company. I wanted him to be the naive child blinded by love. "Is it done?" Derek asked. His voice was breathless, vibrating with a frantic, desperate energy. "Did the wire transfers go through? Are we clear?" My remaining hope instantly shattered. He was not a victim. He was not oblivious. He was actively waiting for the theft's confirmation. Trevor let out an arrogant chuckle. "Calm down, little man," he sneered. "The $12 million is safely out of the corporate accounts. It is bouncing through the international routing maze right now. It will hit the offshore accounts by tomorrow morning. You are saved." I heard Derek collapsing onto a leather sofa, releasing a shuddering sigh of relief. "Oh, thank God," Derek breathed. "Thank God. You have no idea the kind of pressure I have been under. They called me twice yesterday. They said if the final payment was not processed by Friday, they were going to come to the estate. They were going to hurt me." Monica's voice cut through the air. "They were going to hurt you because you are an absolute idiot, Derek. I told you to stop going to those underground games. I told you that you were in way over your head. But you could not stop playing the big shot. You gambled away your personal trust fund on terrible hands, and then you started borrowing from people who break legs for a living." I stood frozen. Gambling debts. Millions of dollars in underground gambling debts. That was the terrible secret driving this entire operation. My son, the boy I had given every conceivable advantage, had squandered his fortune chasing the thrill of high-stakes wagers. He had borrowed from violent creditors, digging a hole so deep, the only way out was cannibalizing his father's empire. "I have been covering your pathetic losses for months," Monica continued, her voice rising in anger. "If I had not brought Trevor in to execute this corporate sweep, you would be dead in an alley by the end of the week. So do not come in here acting like a victim. You owe me your life." "I know, Monica, I know," Derek pleaded. His voice was incredibly small and utterly pathetic. "I am sorry. I just needed the $12 million to clear the principal debt and the interest penalties. But what about my dad? When the accounting department realizes the operational fund is empty, they are going to panic. They will trace the authorizations directly back to my signature. I am the one who stamped the invoices. If my dad wakes up and demands an audit, I am going to federal prison for corporate embezzlement." "He is not going to wake up, Drek," Monica snapped. "That is the entire point of the chemical treatments. The neurotoxins are compounding in his system perfectly. He is going to Alaska for 3 weeks. I paid the lodge staff a fortune to keep him sedated. When he comes back, his brain will be absolute mush. We will take him straight to the neurologist, get the final signature on the medical power of attorney, and have him declared permanently incompetent. He will be locked away in a memory care facility for the rest of his life. He will never even remember his own name." I listened to the silence that followed her horrific declaration. I waited for my son to object. I waited for the biological bond of father and son to overpower his cowardice. I waited for Derek to say that chemically destroying his father's brain was a bridge too far, that there had to be another way. "Okay, Dad," Derek finally whispered. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. "Okay. Just make sure the facility is nice. I do not want him to suffer. He has always been good to us. I just need to survive this." The sound of his cowardly agreement echoed through the sterile penthouse bunker. It was the definitive death knell of my family. He was willing to let me be poisoned, locked away, and chemically erased from existence, simply to cover his own mistakes. He was a parasite entirely willing to kill the host to save his skin. I set the glass down on the wooden side table. My hand was perfectly steady. The grief that had been tightening my chest just moments ago completely evaporated. It was entirely replaced by a cold, calculating, and terrifying serenity. I looked across the room at Bradley. My attorney was staring at the speaker, his jaw clenched tightly, his eyes blazing with professional outrage. He had known me for 20 years. He knew the sacrifices I made for my son. "Did you get all of that, Gavin?" I asked. My voice was a low, dangerous rumble. Gavin nodded slowly, his fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard to save the audio files. "Every single syllable is perfectly captured and backed up on 3 separate, highly encrypted external servers, Mr. Harrison. We have the full confession of corporate embezzlement, the intent to commit severe medical fraud, and the direct admission of poisoning." Bradley stepped forward, holding a stack of the highlighted corporate bylaws. "This is more than enough to trigger a catastrophic legal avalanche, William. We can freeze every single asset they possess. We can intercept the $12 million wire transfer before it clears the offshore routing maze. We can have them both arrested for federal wire fraud and attempted murder by tomorrow afternoon." "No," I replied firmly. I walked over to the black folding table and leaned over the glowing monitors. Arresting them tomorrow is far too easy. It is too quick. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of deception. They wanted to steal my company and lock me away in the dark. I am not going to simply send them to prison. I am going to let them believe they have won. Then I will systematically strip away everything they care about until they are begging for the mercy of a jail cell. I turned to Gavin. Find the offshore accounts in the Bahamas. Trace the routing numbers Trevor used for the $12 million. I do not want you to stop the transfer. I want you to hijack the destination. Reroute the entire sum into a blind, untouchable trust fund that I control exclusively. Let them think the money is safe right up until the exact moment they try to withdraw it to pay their violent creditors. Gavin smiled a sharp, dangerous grin. It will be an absolute pleasure, sir. I then looked across the room at Bradley. Prepare the documents to liquidate Derek's personal estate. Revoke his corporate authority retroactively. We are going to build an inescapable cage. When I return from Alaska, they will find out exactly who they have truly betrayed. The silence in the penthouse stretched into a deep, heavy stillness, broken only by the rhythmic, frantic clacking of Gavin's mechanical keyboard. He had immediately plunged back into the digital depths of the corporate network, his pale face illuminated by the sharp blue light of the monitors. I stood motionless behind him, watching lines of code cascade across the screens like falling rain. Bradley paced the length of the room, his phone pressed firmly to his ear, quietly issuing rapid instructions to his team of associate attorneys. We were constructing a financial net so tightly woven that not a single stolen dollar would be able to slip through. The $12 million had left the operational liquidity fund just an hour ago. To Derek and Monica, the money was already gone lost in the vast ocean of international banking. But they had fundamentally underestimated the caliber of the men I employed. Gavin leaned closer to his central screen, his eyes tracking the digital footprint of the massive wire transfer. He explained his process in a low, steady voice, never breaking his intense concentration. He told me that moving $12 million across international borders was not like handing someone cash. It required digital handshakes, clearinghouse approvals, and a highly specific chain of routing protocols. Trevor had attempted to mask the transfer by fracturing the total amount into hundreds of smaller, seemingly innocuous payments to a network of dummy corporations. He had labeled them as overseas consulting fees, logistical acquisitions, and international vendor retainers. It was a sophisticated smokescreen designed to overwhelm standard corporate auditors. But Gavin was not a standard auditor. He was actively hunting the core algorithm Trevor had used to distribute the funds. Within 45 minutes, Gavin had isolated the primary routing sequence. He brought up a complex digital map on the secondary monitor, displaying a web of red lines connecting our Chicago headquarters to a series of offshore banking servers located in the Bahamas. Trevor had routed the entire $12 million through a digital labyrinth, but every single red line ultimately converged on 3 specific holding accounts in Nassau. The money had arrived sitting quietly in the tropical tax haven, completely out of the reach of standard American judicial jurisdiction. Gavin looked over his shoulder at me, a grim smile playing on his lips. He confirmed that the funds had landed, but he also noted that Trevor had made a critical, arrogant mistake. He had used the same encrypted virtual private network to establish the offshore accounts that he was currently using to access the corporate servers from Derek's office. That single thread of arrogance was all Gavin needed to pry the door completely open. I watched as he launched a highly aggressive, targeted assault on the banking firewalls protecting the Bahamian holding accounts. The tension in the windowless room became almost suffocating. Bradley ended his phone call and stepped up beside me, his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw set in stone. For 20 agonizing minutes, the monitors flashed with access, denied warnings and security prompts. Then with a sudden, sharp keystroke, the screen went completely black before blooming into a stark, white interface. Gavin had bypassed the final layer of international security. We were officially inside the offshore shell companies. Gavin rapidly opened the core files quangmao1_15.docx and quangmao2_15.docx for the three Bahamian holding accounts. He pulled up the official ownership ledgers, the authorized signatories, and the primary beneficiaries of the $12 million. I braced myself, expecting to see Derek's name plastered across the legal registry documents. I expected to see the final, undeniable proof that my own flesh and blood had orchestrated this massive corporate theft to cover his pathetic underground gambling debts. I was entirely prepared to face the ultimate betrayal of a son destroying his father. But as Gavin magnified the registry documents on the large central screen, my breath caught painfully in my throat. I leaned closer, my eyes scanning the crisp black text. The holding accounts did not belong to my son. Derek's name was completely absent from every single ledger, every authorization form, and every beneficiary designation. The shell companies were registered exclusively to two people, Monica Harrison and Trevor. The sheer gravity of the revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. The air in the penthouse seemed to grow instantly colder. Bradley let out a low, sharp breath, murmuring a quiet oath under his breath, as the horrific reality of the situation painted itself across the glowing monitors. I stared at the names, the puzzle pieces of the last 3 months violently slamming into place to form a picture so profoundly evil it defied human comprehension. Derek was not the mastermind. He was not even a partner in the theft. He was nothing but a pathetic, manipulated pawn. The conversation I had intercepted earlier replayed in my mind with terrifying new context. Monica had deliberately fueled Derek's gambling addiction. She had allowed him to dig a multi-million-dollar hole with violent underground creditors. She had intentionally backed him into a corner of pure, desperate terror, knowing he would be too cowardly to come to me for help. When he was completely broken and terrified for his life, she had swooped in as his savior, introducing her fake cousin Trevor to execute the corporate sweep. She convinced Derek that funneling the $12 million out of the company was the only way to save his life and pay off the debts. She forced him to use his own executive authority, his own signature, to authorize every single fraudulent invoice. But the money was never going to the creditors. It was never going to clear his debts. Monica and Trevor had stolen the entire $12 million directly out of the corporate operational fund, and they were keeping every last cent for themselves. They had essentially used Derek's terror to rob the company blind. I stood in the sterile bunker, my hands gripping the edge of the black folding table, as the absolute perfection of their sinister plan became agonizingly clear. Monica and Trevor were going to let the $12 million sit safely in the Bahamas. They were going to wait until I returned from my fake fishing trip. They were going to continue poisoning my coffee and my medication until my brain was completely destroyed. Then they were going to have me legally committed to a permanent memory care facility, effectively neutralizing the only person capable of uncovering the theft. Once I was locked away in a chemical prison, the accounting department would inevitably discover the massive hole in the operational liquidity fund. They would launch an internal audit. The paper trail would lead directly and exclusively to Derek. His signature was on every single fraudulent invoice. His executive credentials were tied to every unauthorized wire transfer. The authorities would discover his massive gambling debts and immediately conclude that he had embezzled the corporate funds to save himself. Derek would face federal prosecution. He would be completely unable to explain where the money went because he had no access to the offshore accounts. The violent creditors would still be hunting him for the unpaid debts. He would be entirely destroyed, facing decades in federal prison, while his father rotted in a psychiatric ward completely unaware of his own identity. And Monica would play the part of the devastated, betrayed wife. She would file for an immediate divorce, claiming she had no idea her husband was a corporate embezzler and a gambling addict. She would walk away clean, completely free from the scandal, and disappear with Trevor to the Bahamas to live out the rest of their lives on my stolen fortune. They had designed a perfect, inescapable slaughterhouse for my entire family. A wave of profound, suffocating sorrow washed over me. I felt a deep, agonizing pity for my son. Derek was weak. He was entitled, arrogant, and foolish. He had made terrible decisions and had proven himself to be a coward. But he did not deserve this. He did not deserve to be led to the slaughter by the woman he loved. He was sitting in his luxurious home right now, breathing a sigh of relief, genuinely believing that the worst was over, completely unaware that the executioner's blade was already swinging down toward his neck. The sorrow lasted for only a fleeting moment. It was instantly consumed by an inferno of pure, unadulterated rage. The fury I felt was no longer just the anger of a betrayed corporate founder. It was the primal, violent wrath of a father watching predators circle his child. Monica and Trevor thought they were playing a brilliant game of chess. They thought they had outmaneuvered a frail, clueless old man and his foolish, desperate son. They had absolutely no idea that I was currently staring directly into the heart of their operation, holding the matches that would burn their entire world to ash and to dust right now. The silence in the windowless penthouse was suddenly broken by the rapid, rhythmic clacking of Gavin striking the keys of his mechanical keyboard. The revelation of the Bahamian shell companies had completely shifted the landscape of this war. I stood over the black folding table, my eyes locked on the digital ledgers that proved Derek was entirely excluded from the stolen $12 million. But the human mind always demands complete comprehension. I needed to understand the mechanics of this betrayal. How had a woman who smiled so warmly at my dinner table orchestrated such a flawless, devastating corporate hijacking? I turned to Gavin and ordered him to dig deeper into the cloned data of the phone belonging to Monica. I told him to tear through every encrypted folder, every deleted message, and every hidden vault she possessed. I wanted the absolute, unfiltered truth, no matter how brutal it was. Gavin did not hesitate. His pale fingers flew across the keyboard, launching a secondary infiltration protocol directly into the personal cloud storage backups of Monica. He explained that people like Monica, people who construct their entire lives upon a foundation of lies, always kept a secret cache of leverage. They could never resist the urge to document their own perceived brilliance. The blue light from the massive monitors cast long, shifting shadows across the sterile walls of the command center. Bradley stood silently beside me, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his legal mind undoubtedly calculating the shifting dynamics of criminal liability. We waited in the cold, humming bunker as the digital extraction process crawled across the screen. Within 15 minutes, Gavin successfully bypassed the secondary biometric encryption shielding the private cloud drive of Monica. He isolated a highly secured, heavily hidden folder buried deep within a directory of mundane fitness applications and digital shopping receipts. The folder was simply titled with a single innocuous period. Gavin highlighted the hidden directory and initiated a forced decryption sequence. The progress bar flashed green, and the folder burst open across the center monitor. It was not a collection of financial spreadsheets or corporate documents. It was a massive, carefully curated archive of high-definition video files and high-quality audio recordings. Gavin selected the most recently modified video file and clicked play. The large screen instantly filled with a jarringly familiar visual. My stomach violently churned as I recognized the distinctive, hand-carved mahogany bed frame and the rich burgundy silk curtains of the primary guest suite within my own Lincoln Park estate. The very room I had generously provided for visiting family members had been completely desecrated. The video was shot from a stable, stationary angle, likely a camera propped up on the antique dresser. Monica lay in the center of the large bed, her dark hair scattered across the pristine white pillows. Beside her, resting comfortably against the headboard with a glass of my premium scotch in his hand, was Trevor. He was not wearing his slick, expensive Italian suit. The man who had been introduced to me just yesterday as the distant financial consultant cousin of Monica was intimately, undeniably entwined with the wife of my son. I watched in absolute paralyzed disgust as the video played out in real time. They were not simply having a casual, opportunistic affair. The incredibly relaxed, deeply familiar way they spoke to one another practically screamed of years of shared history and countless layered deceptions. Trevor reached out, tracing a lazy circle on the shoulder of Monica, a wicked, triumphant smile plastered across his arrogant face. "I cannot believe the idiot actually bought the cousin story." Trevor laughed, his voice echoing loudly through the penthouse speakers. "I thought Derek was going to pass out from sheer panic when I walked into the corporate suite." Monica let out a sharp, genuine laugh, a sound completely devoid of the sickly sweet tone she used when speaking to me. "Derek is entirely spineless," she replied, taking a sip from the glass held by Trevor. "He has been completely paralyzed by fear for months. It is honestly pathetic to watch him try to act like a commanding executive when he knows we are holding his entire life in the palm of our hands. We have been planning this for 5 years, Trevor. 5 long, miserable years of me playing the devoted, loving wife to a weak little boy and smiling at that arrogant, overbearing old man. But it is finally paying off. The 12 million is just the beginning. Once the brain of the old man completely melts from the compounds I have been slipping into his espresso, we take the entire estate, the trust funds, the liquid assets, everything. We will never have to hide again." The video ended, leaving a stark, frozen frame of their victorious, intertwined silhouettes. The reality of the footage crashed into me like a freight train. Trevor was not a cousin. He was not a financial consultant. He was the long-term, deeply entrenched lover of Monica. They had been actively conspiring against my family for half a decade. Every holiday dinner, every birthday celebration, every moment of supposed familial bonding had been a meticulously choreographed performance designed to camouflage a massive predatory infiltration. They had targeted Derek because he was weak, and they had targeted me because I was wealthy. Bradley let out a long, slow breath, his voice tight with barely contained professional rage. "This is premeditated, deeply coordinated wire fraud conspiracy to commit murder and massive corporate embezzlement," he stated clearly. "They have handed us the absolute, unassailable proof of their entire operation." But the puzzle was still missing one crucial, central piece. I stared at the frozen image on the screen, my mind working furiously to connect the final dots. Why was Derek complying? My son was a coward, yes, but he was also fundamentally selfish and deeply protective of his own inheritance. He would never voluntarily hand over $12 million of his future wealth to his wife and a stranger, regardless of his underground gambling debts. A mere financial mistake was simply not enough leverage to force an heir to actively participate in the chemical poisoning of his own father. There had to be something far more sinister binding him to their plot. I turned back to the glowing monitors and instructed Gavin to cross-reference the extracted audio files. I told him to look for any hidden voice memos, any recorded phone calls, or any archived conversations between Monica and Derek that Monica had secretly preserved for leverage. Gavin typed furiously, establishing a search algorithm tailored to isolate vocal stress patterns and heightened emotional frequencies. Within moments, the system flagged a specific heavily encrypted audio file that had been originally deleted from the phone of Derek, but covertly saved to the hidden cloud vault of Monica. The file was simply timestamped exactly 2 years ago. Gavin isolated the audio track, enhanced the vocal clarity to remove background static, and routed the sound through the primary penthouse speakers. The audio file began with the sound of a door slamming violently shut, followed immediately by the heavy, frantic sound of someone hyperventilating. It was Derek. His breathing was rapid, shallow, and filled with absolute, unadulterated terror. "Monica, you have to help me." Derek sobbed, his voice completely broken and panicked. I did not see him. I swear to God, I did not see him step into the crosswalk. It was dark and the rain was so heavy. I panicked. I just kept driving. I could not stop. My career would be ruined. Dad would completely destroy me. I hit him, Monica. The front bumper is smashed. There is blood on the shattered headlight. You have to tell me what to do. I am going to federal prison." The silence was absolute. I stood perfectly still. My son committed a hit and run. He had struck a pedestrian in the dark and fled the scene to protect his reputation. He ran into the arms of a sociopath. Monica spoke remarkably calm, chillingly composed, and entirely devoid of any natural human empathy. She did not sound shocked. She sounded victorious. "Derek, you need to listen to me very carefully," she commanded, her tone dropping into a low, terrifying register. "Drive the car into the private underground garage. Do not speak to anyone. I know a mechanic who operates completely off the books. He will replace the bumper and destroy the shattered glass. I will personally clean the biological evidence from the hood. We are going to erase this entirely. You will never speak of this night again." "But Derek, you need to understand something. I am saving your life right now. I am keeping you out of a federal penitentiary. I will hide the damaged parts in a secure storage unit under a false name. I will keep the dashcam footage safely locked away. And you are going to owe me everything. Do you understand everything?" The heavy silence in the windowless penthouse was completely suffocating after the audio recording ended. Everything. Monica had said that single word with such chilling finality, locking my son into a lifetime of servitude and criminal complicity. I stared at the blank monitor, my mind slowly processing the sheer magnitude of her malevolence. She had literally orchestrated a cover-up of a federal crime, hiding the damaged vehicle and hoarding the biological evidence simply to forge an unbreakable chain of blackmail around the neck of her own husband. Derek was not just a coward hiding from his massive gambling debts. He was a hostage trapped in a cage constructed of his own reckless stupidity and her calculated sadism. But pity is a fleeting emotion when survival is on the line. Derek had chosen to run from that dark street, and he had chosen to sacrifice me rather than face the consequences of his own actions. Before I could fully articulate my thoughts to Bradley, Gavin suddenly stiffened in his chair. His pale hands hovered over the mechanical keyboard, his eyes darting frantically across the rightmost monitor. The blue glow illuminated a fresh stream of data pouring into the secure server. Gavin had not just breached her hidden cloud vault. He had established a persistent active mirror of her primary email account, intercepting outgoing drafts before they were even sent to the designated recipients. Mr. Harrison, Gavin said, his voice unusually strained and completely lacking its previous confident swagger. "You need to look at this right now. She is accelerating the timeline." I walked slowly around the black folding table and stood directly behind his leather chair. Bradley moved to my left, leaning in to examine the glowing screen. Gavin opened a heavily encrypted portable document format file that Monica had just attached to a draft email addressed to Trevor. The subject line was simply labeled as the final phase execution strategy. As I read the dense legal text displayed on the monitor, the remaining fragments of my paternal sorrow completely vanished. It was a comprehensive, meticulously drafted medical power of attorney document. It completely stripped me of all my legal rights, my financial autonomy, and my personal agency. But the document itself was not the most horrifying part. It was the attached medical evaluation. It was signed, stamped, and officially notarized by a highly prominent, wildly expensive private psychiatrist who operated out of a luxury clinic in the northern suburbs. I knew this doctor by reputation only. He was known for catering to wealthy, discreet families who needed unsavory problems to quietly disappear. The evaluation detailed a massive, rapid, and completely irreversible cognitive decline. It falsely documented a long history of severe paranoia, aggressive physical outbursts, and profound memory loss. It stated that I was an immediate danger to myself and others, requiring permanent involuntary commitment to a highly secure memory care facility. Monica had successfully bribed a licensed medical professional to fabricate a legally binding psychiatric death sentence for me. I read the detailed execution plan she had outlined for Trevor. They were not simply going to file the paperwork quietly. They wanted a public spectacle to ensure that no one on the corporate board of directors would ever question my sudden removal. The execution was scheduled for the night of my 70th birthday gala. The event was set to take place in exactly 3 weeks at the grand ballroom of the downtown hotel. Over 300 guests were invited. It was going to be a massive gathering of industry leaders, corporate partners, influential politicians, and high society elites. Everyone who mattered in my professional universe would be in attendance. The email coldly detailed the precise logistics of their final strike. Monica planned to slip a massive, highly concentrated dose of heavy liquid sedatives and specialized neurotoxins directly into my celebratory champagne toast. The dosage was carefully calculated to trigger a catastrophic physical and mental collapse right in the middle of my speech. When I inevitably collapsed on the stage, violently shaking and speaking in incoherent, drug-induced gibberish in front of 300 horrified witnesses, the trap would perfectly snap shut. The email confirmed that Trevor had already placed a discreet private medical transport team on standby, waiting in the loading dock of the hotel. The hired paramedics would rush into the ballroom, strap me to a gurney, and haul me away under the guise of an acute medical emergency. My sudden, highly public mental breakdown would serve as the undeniable, indisputable visual proof required to validate the forged psychiatric evaluation. I would be locked inside the sterile, windowless walls of a private psychiatric ward before the sun even came up. Once I was legally committed and stripped of my competency, the final prize would be left completely unprotected. Monica had explicitly detailed the financial objective in the final paragraph of her message. The $12 million she and Trevor had stolen from the corporate operational fund was merely the appetizer. The true target was my personal, untouchable estate. Upon the execution of the medical power of attorney, Monica would gain absolute unilateral control over my remaining $50 million private trust fund. She would have the legal authority to liquidate my real estate holdings, sell off my remaining corporate shares, and drain every single bank account I possessed. She and Trevor would quietly bleed my $50 million trust entirely dry, leaving Derek to face the inevitable corporate audit alone. The depth of their logistical planning was almost impressively psychotic. Monica had even gone so far as to select the exact private psychiatric facility. It was an isolated, highly restrictive compound, situated in a remote, heavily wooded region, located nearly 4 hours completely outside the city limits. The facility was explicitly known for its absolute ironclad privacy protocols, essentially guaranteeing that outside visitors were strictly prohibited without the direct express authorization of the designated legal guardian. She was systematically planning to bury me alive in a gilded, isolated tomb where no one would ever be able to hear me scream or demand a secondary medical evaluation. Furthermore, Trevor had meticulously drafted the subsequent press releases and the internal corporate memos. The documents were pre-written and ready to be automatically distributed to the shareholders and the media outlets the very next morning. The press release expressed profound, manufactured family sorrow regarding my sudden, tragic, and completely unexpected cognitive collapse. It officially assured the jittery financial markets that Derek was incredibly prepared to step up and assume permanent, absolute control of the entire corporate enterprise to maintain market stability. I stared at the glowing monitor, absorbing the sheer, breathtaking cruelty of their master plan. They intended to parade me in front of my peers, strip me of my dignity, poison my body, and bury me alive in a clinical prison, all while smiling for the cameras. The silence in the penthouse command center was absolutely deafening. Bradley stood rigidly beside me, his jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle fluttered wildly in his cheek. He was a veteran of vicious corporate warfare, but even he seemed momentarily paralyzed by the absolute depravity displayed on the screen. Gavin slowly took his hands off the keyboard, turning his chair to look at me, waiting for a reaction. They expected a frail, fading old man to drink his poisoned champagne and quietly fade into the dark. They expected me to surrender my life's work and my freedom without a single fight. They were relying entirely on the illusion of my weakness to execute their flawless victory. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, letting the cold, sterile air of the bunker wash over my face. The last lingering shadows of hesitation, the final remnants of familial devotion, were completely eradicated from my soul. I opened my eyes, and the vision was perfectly clear. The sadness was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, deeply calculated, and incredibly focused fury. I turned away from the monitors and looked directly at Bradley. My voice was low, smooth, and as hard as solid granite. "Prepare the trap, Bradley," I instructed firmly. "Draft the counter-injunctions, secure the shadow trusts, and coordinate with the private security contractors. I want an ironclad legal cage constructed around every single asset they think they are about to steal. Gavin, you maintain the digital overwatch. Track every single message, every single dollar, and every single forged signature. We do not stop them. We do not interrupt their precious timeline. We are going to let them think they have won. We are going to let them walk right into that ballroom, raise their glasses, and believe they have successfully executed their flawless masterstroke. And when the trap finally springs shut, we will make sure they lose absolutely everything they have ever valued. They believed they were the predators in this house. They were wrong. I am the true monster hiding in the dark, and I will tear their lives apart." The 3 weeks leading up to my 70th birthday gala were an agonizing exercise in absolute restraint. Every single morning I continued the ritual of pouring the toxic espresso down the drain and discarding the fraudulent pills. Every single evening I sat at my dining room table and forced myself to smile affectionately at the two people who were actively trying to erase my existence. I listened to Derek brag about non-existent corporate milestones, while Monica softly patted my trembling hand, whispering that I needed to rest my tired mind. They were completely convinced that their insidious chemical cocktail was systematically destroying my cognitive functions. I gave them a flawless performance, stumbling over my words, forgetting recent conversations, and staring vacantly out the windows for hours. Behind the scenes, Bradley and Gavin had flawlessly constructed the ultimate legal and digital fortress. Every stolen dollar was securely frozen in a ghost account, and every corporate asset was fortified by impenetrable injunctions. The trap was perfectly laid, waiting only for the predators to step onto the stage. The evening of the gala finally arrived, wrapped in the crisp, biting chill of a Chicago autumn. The event was held in the legendary Grand Ballroom of the Drake Hotel, a venue I had specifically chosen for its opulent, uncompromising grandeur. Crystal chandeliers the size of small vehicles hung from the vaulted gold-leafed ceilings, casting a brilliant, glittering light over the sea of attendees. 300 of the most influential figures in the city were gathered in their finest formal wear. Corporate titans, political allies, banking executives, and society elites mingled over imported champagne and silver trays of caviar. The room buzzed with the low, steady hum of wealth and power. It was the absolute pinnacle of my professional legacy, perfectly arranged to serve as the backdrop for my public execution. I arrived at the grand entrance in the back of my chauffeured town car, sitting quietly beside Derek and Monica. As the uniformed valet opened my door, I took a deep, shuddering breath and instantly dropped my physical posture. I allowed my shoulders to slump heavily forward. I let my hands tremble as I gripped the polished handle of my wooden cane. I forced my eyes to widen in a vacant, bewildered stare, acting completely overwhelmed by the flashing cameras and the sudden roar of the crowded lobby. Monica was out of the car in an instant, rushing to my side with a sickeningly sweet smile plastered across her face. She wore a stunning backless crimson evening gown that commanded attention, looking every bit the tragic, devoted daughter-in-law. She linked her arm tightly through mine, pulling me close effectively, guiding me like a blind, helpless child. "Just take slow, small steps, Dad," she whispered softly into my ear, though her grip on my arm was painfully tight. "Stay right beside me. We are going to get you safely to your seat." I shuffled my feet across the polished marble floor, letting my shoes drag slightly against the stone. I kept my gaze fixed firmly on the ground, intentionally avoiding eye contact with the dozens of colleagues and friends who stepped forward to greet me. I could hear the hushed, concerned murmurs rippling through the crowd as we made our way into the main ballroom. I heard the pity in their voices. They were looking at the mighty William Harrison and seeing nothing but a broken, fading shadow of a man. Derek walked close behind us, his chest puffed out in a tailored tuxedo, looking deeply solemn and responsible. He nodded gravely to the board members we passed, silently confirming the tragic rumors of my rapid decline. They were putting on an absolute masterclass in manipulative theater. Monica successfully navigated me through the sea of guests and deposited me into a plush velvet chair at the center of the massive head table. The table was elevated on a raised dais, providing an unobstructed view of the entire room. I sat there hunched over my pristine white napkin, allowing my mouth to hang slightly open. I let my hands shake as I reached for my water glass, clumsily sloshing a few drops onto the crisp linen tablecloth. Monica immediately swooped in, dabbing at the spill with a napkin, offering me a look of profound, manufactured sympathy. Through my lowered eyelashes, I scanned the perimeter of the grand ballroom. My mind was sharp, evaluating every single exit and every stationed individual. Standing discreetly near the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall were two massive, broad-shouldered men wearing ill-fitting dark suits. They were not hotel security. They did not have the relaxed, observant posture of event staff. They stood rigidly, their eyes locked intensely on the head table, waiting for a signal. These were the bribed medical handlers Monica and Trevor had placed on standby. They were the muscle hired to strap me to a gurney and haul me out of the hotel the moment I collapsed. They were waiting to drag me into a windowless chemical prison. I slowly shifted my gaze to the far right corner of the room. Standing completely still in the shadows near the secondary service exit was Bradley Foster. My attorney was dressed in a sharp black tuxedo, holding a sleek leather portfolio tightly against his side. He offered me the briefest, almost imperceptible nod. The private security contractors we had hired were already in position, silently securing the perimeter, seamlessly blending in with the catering staff and the valet attendants. The invisible cage was locked. There was absolutely no way out of this room for Monica, Derek, or Trevor. The dinner service commenced in a blur of clinking silverware and subdued, elegant music provided by a live string quartet. Course after course of gourmet cuisine was placed in front of me, but I merely pushed the food around my porcelain plate with a trembling fork, maintaining my role as the disoriented patient. Monica sat beside me, radiating a quiet, triumphant energy. Every few minutes she would lean over and whisper patronizing encouragements, visibly playing the saint for the benefit of the watching corporate board members seated at the adjacent tables. She was setting the stage, ensuring that everyone in the room witnessed my absolute frailty before she delivered her final devastating blow. As the dessert plates were slowly cleared away by the waitstaff, the string quartet gracefully faded their music into silence. The low hum of conversation gradually died down as the guests anticipated the evening speeches. I watched Monica reach under the table and pull a small crystal champagne flute from her lap. It was already filled with a sparkling golden liquid. I knew exactly what was inside that specific glass. It was the massive, concentrated dose of sedatives and neurotoxins designed to trigger my public collapse. She smoothly placed the tainted glass directly in front of me, swapping it with my original water goblet. She offered me a warm, dazzling smile, her eyes glittering with dark, poisonous intent. "Drink your champagne, Dad," she whispered, her voice dripping with lethal sweetness. "It is almost time for the toasts." I stared down at the bubbling liquid. I let my hands shake violently as I slowly wrapped my fingers around the delicate crystal stem. I did not lift the glass. I simply held it, waiting for her to make her move. Monica gracefully stood up from her chair. She picked up a silver spoon and gently tapped it against her own champagne flute. The sharp, clear, ringing sound cut through the vast ballroom. The final murmurs of conversation completely ceased. 300 faces turned toward the elevated head table. The spotlight shifted, bathing Monica in a bright, angelic glow. She stepped confidently up to the standing microphone positioned at the center of the dais. She looked out over the massive crowd, her expression morphing instantly into a mask of profound, devastating sorrow. It was a flawless physiological shift. Her shoulders dropped slightly, and her lower lip trembled with perfectly calculated emotion. Before she spoke a single word, I watched her subtle, rapid movements. She briefly caught the eye of Trevor, who was seated at a prominent table near the front. He offered her a slick, arrogant smirk. Then her eyes darted to the back of the room. She gave a sharp, definitive nod to the two burly men standing by the exit doors. The medical handlers immediately stiffened, stepping forward slightly, preparing to execute their extraction protocol. The signal was given. The final sequence was officially activated. Thank you all for being here tonight. To celebrate the incredible life and legacy of William Harrison, Monica began. Her voice echoed through the towering speakers, rich, melodious, and laced with manufactured grief. We gathered this evening to honor a man who has built an empire from the ground up, a man who has given so much of himself to this city, to his clients, and to his family. She paused, lowering her head, taking a deep, shuddering breath as if fighting back tears. I sat rigidly in my chair, staring at the tablecloth, listening to the absolute venom dripping from her words. She was eulogizing me while I was still breathing. But tonight is also a profoundly difficult evening for our family, she continued, her voice breaking with dramatic perfection. As many of you have undoubtedly noticed, William has been struggling recently. Over the past few months, we have watched him battle a sudden, tragic, and severely aggressive mental decline. It has broken our hearts to see such a brilliant, formidable mind succumb to this devastating condition. He is no longer the man who built this great company. He is lost, confused, and terribly vulnerable. A collective gasp rippled through the grand ballroom. I could hear the hushed whispers of shock and pity from the board members. Derek sat beside me, staring dutifully at his hands playing the role of the heartbroken son. He was silently endorsing every single lie she told the crowd. We have consulted with top medical professionals, Monica said, her tone shifting from sorrow to resolute strength. We have done everything in our power to manage this tragedy privately. But the reality is, William requires permanent, specialized medical care that we can no longer provide at home. Furthermore, the immense weight of his corporate estate and his financial holdings can no longer rest upon his fading shoulders. It is simply not safe for him, and it is not safe for this company. She looked directly at the front tables, locking eyes with the primary shareholders of my firm. Therefore, to protect him and to protect the incredible legacy he spent his entire life building, Derek and I must step forward. We must take the heavy burden of his estate into our own hands. Effective immediately, we will be assuming complete medical and legal power of attorney over all of William's affairs. We will ensure he is placed in a secure, comfortable facility where he can no longer accidentally harm himself or this company's future. It is the most painful decision we have ever had to make, but it is the only way to save him. She finished her speech and turned her gaze down toward me, waiting for the poison to take hold. She was waiting for me to drink from the tainted glass and collapse onto the floor. She wanted the grand finale. I released my grip on the crystal champagne flute. I stopped my hands from shaking. I slowly lifted my head, completely shedding the mask of the confused, broken old man. I looked directly into Monica's eyes, and I watched the triumphant smile absolutely freeze on her beautiful, treacherous face. I did not blink. I did not waver. The trembling in my hands ceased entirely. I slowly pushed my shoulders back, feeling the familiar rigid alignment of my spine return. I sat up completely straight, letting my full physical presence occupy the space at the center of the head table. The manufactured fog of confusion instantly drained from my eyes, replaced by an absolute piercing clarity. I watched the blood drain rapidly from Monica's face. Her skin turned the color of ash. Her perfectly choreographed smile shattered, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. She had expected to see a hollow, vacant shell staring back at her. Instead, she was looking directly at the formidable corporate titan she had spent 5 years trying to destroy. The sudden shift in my posture was not lost on the crowd. The ambient noise in the grand ballroom, the hushed whispers of pity and concern abruptly died down. 300 pairs of eyes locked onto the head table. The heavy, suffocating silence returned, but this time it was not driven by sorrow. It was driven by confusion and a growing sense of immense impending tension. Derek, seated to my left, frowned deeply. He leaned forward, his brow furrowed in genuine bewilderment as he looked from me to his wife. Monica stood frozen at the microphone, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the metal stand. She opened her mouth to speak to try and salvage her meticulously crafted narrative, but the words died in her throat. She looked down at the poisoned champagne flute, then back up at my cold, unwavering gaze. She knew in that exact moment that the game was over. She just did not yet comprehend the sheer magnitude of her defeat. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored tuxedo jacket and pulled out a small, rectangular object. It was a pristine crimson-red velvet box. I placed it gently onto the crisp, white tablecloth. The velvet absorbed the light from the massive crystal chandeliers overhead. I placed my right hand flat on the table and slowly, deliberately slid the red box across the polished surface. It stopped exactly 1 inch from the base of Monica's microphone stand. "Open it," I commanded. My voice was a low, resonant baritone that carried easily through the silent room, completely devoid of the frailty I had been projecting for weeks. It was the voice of a man who commanded empires. Monica stared at the red velvet box as if it were a live explosive. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. Her hands, which had been so steady when she delivered my chemical death sentence just minutes ago, were now visibly shaking. She looked desperately out into the audience, her eyes frantically searching for Trevor. He had half risen from his chair at the front table, his arrogant smirk entirely wiped away, replaced by a tense, calculating glare. "I said open it, Monica," I repeated, my tone dropping into a dangerous, uncompromising register. With agonizing slowness, she reached out. Her manicured fingers trembled violently as she gripped the edge of the velvet lid. She popped the small brass clasp and flipped the box open. She stared down at the contents, and a low, guttural gasp escaped her lips. Nestled perfectly inside the molded black satin interior was a pair of heavy, dull gray steel handcuffs. Resting in the center of the metal cuffs was a sleek silver USB flash drive. Tucked neatly behind both items, folded with absolute precision, was a dense, multi-page legal document. "Take the paper out," I instructed softly, yet my words echoed like thunder in the silent ballroom. "Read the front page. Read what you thought you had secured." Monica reached into the box and pulled out the folded document. It was the precise medical power of attorney she had drafted with her corrupt, bribed psychiatrist. The same document she believed would grant her complete control over my $50 million personal trust fund. But the document was no longer clean. Stamped diagonally across the front page in thick, glaringly bright red ink was a single devastating word: void. Below the red stamp, bearing an official, undeniable seal, was the insignia of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Monica dropped the document onto the table as if it had physically burned her flesh. She stumbled backward, bumping heavily against her own chair. Her eyes were wide, darting frantically around the room like a trapped animal, realizing the cage doors had slammed shut. Derek stared at the voided document, his confusion rapidly morphing into sheer panic. "Dad." "What is this?" Derek stammered, his voice cracking. "What is going on here? Why do you have handcuffs in a box?" I did not look at my son. I kept my gaze locked entirely on the woman who had planned to bury me alive. "You thought you were brilliant, Monica," I stated, my voice echoing through the silent, captivated crowd. "You thought you could bleed my company dry, leverage the pathetic mistakes of my son, and lock me away in a chemical prison while you lived out your days in the Bahamas with your lover. You believed you were playing a high-stakes game of chess against a dying man. But you failed to realize that I have controlled the board since the very first piece was moved." I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers once. At the far end of this ballroom, stationed discreetly behind the massive towering speaker system of the event disc jockey, Gavin stepped out of the shadows. He moved with swift, technical precision. He reached down and jammed a secondary encrypted USB drive directly into the primary audio interface. He bypassed the DJ, entirely hijacking the soundboard, with a few rapid adjustments to the equalization sliders. He pushed the master volume control straight up. A sharp crackle of static erupted from the massive speakers cutting through the opulent room. Then a voice filled the air. It was not my voice. It was not the voice of the DJ. It was the smooth, arrogant, and undeniably cruel voice of Trevor. The audio file Gavin had extracted from the hidden cloud vault was playing at maximum volume for 300 of the most influential people in Chicago to hear. "I cannot believe the idiot actually bought the cousin story." Trevor's recorded voice laughed, booming across the crystal chandeliers. "I thought Derek was going to pass out from sheer panic when I walked into the corporate suite." A collective wave of shock crashed through the audience. Guests gasped, covering their mouths in horror. Corporate board members leaned forward, their faces pale with disbelief. Then the recorded voice of Monica answered him, ringing out with crystalline clarity. "Derek is entirely spineless," the recording declared. "He has been completely paralyzed by fear for months. It is honestly pathetic to watch him try to act like a commanding executive when he knows we are holding his entire life in the palm of our hands. We have been planning this for 5 years, Trevor. 5 long, miserable years of me playing the devoted, loving wife to a weak little boy and smiling at that arrogant, overbearing old man. I watched Derek physically collapse into his chair. The color drained from his face entirely. He stared at his wife, his mouth hanging open, his entire reality crumbling into dust. The woman he loved, the woman he had committed federal wire fraud for, was mocking his cowardice in front of the entire city. The audio recording continued relentlessly exposing the darkest, most terrifying layer of their plot. "The 12 million is just the beginning." Monica's recorded voice sneered through the speakers. "Once the brain of the old man completely melts from the compounds I have been slipping into his espresso, we take the entire estate, the trust funds, the liquid assets, everything." The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. Shouts of horror and outrage echoed from every single table. The prominent guests, the political allies, and the banking executives were staring at Monica and Trevor with expressions of pure, unadulterated disgust. They were listening to a detailed, undeniable confession of conspiracy to commit murder, corporate embezzlement, and massive medical fraud. Trevor did not wait for the recording to finish. He kicked his chair backward, sending it crashing into the table behind him. He spun around, his eyes frantically scanning the room for an exit. He darted toward the secondary service doors, moving with the desperate speed of a cornered rat. Monica, realizing the sheer, inescapable magnitude of her destruction, let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She hiked up the skirt of her crimson evening gown and sprinted away from the head table, rushing blindly toward the main entrance. The 2 burly, bribed medical handlers stationed by the heavy oak doors immediately stepped forward, attempting to create a barricade to allow Monica to escape. They reached inside their ill-fitting jackets, their faces set in aggressive, defensive grimaces. But they never even had the chance to draw their weapons. The trap I had meticulously built with Bradley finally violently sprang shut. Dozens of the impeccably dressed catering staff, the waiters holding silver trays, and the sommeliers pouring champagne suddenly moved with terrifying coordinated precision. They dropped their silver trays. They ripped off their white aprons and black bow ties. Beneath their formal disguises, they were wearing tactical vests and heavy dark Kevlar. They were not event staff. They were heavily armed, highly trained undercover agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "Federal agents, stay exactly where you are," a commanding voice roared over the chaotic din of the ballroom. In a matter of seconds, the room transformed into a tactical takedown. 4 undercover agents swarmed the 2 bribed medical handlers, tackling them forcefully to the polished marble floor before they could even unholster their weapons. The heavy thud of bodies hitting the stone echoed sharply. Handcuffs ratcheted shut with loud metallic clicks. Trevor was intercepted halfway to the service doors. 3 agents converged on him, grabbing his expensive suit jacket and slamming him hard against a decorative marble pillar. He yelled in protest, struggling violently, but he was completely overpowered. An agent twisted his arms behind his back, locking the steel cuffs tightly around his wrists. The architect of the $12 million theft was pinned against the wall, utterly neutralized and completely humiliated in front of the very people he had sought to impress. Monica did not make it to the main entrance. As she sprinted down the central aisle, her crimson dress trailing behind her like a stream of blood, a tall, formidable female agent stepped directly into her path. Monica screamed, trying to claw her way past, but the agent grabbed her firmly by the shoulders, spinning her around and forcing her face down onto a nearby dining table. Fine china and crystal glasses shattered onto the floor. "Let go of me," Monica shrieked hysterically, her voice raw and ragged. "You cannot do this. I have rights. You have no proof." The female agent ignored her cries efficiently, securing her wrists with heavy steel cuffs. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and attempted murder," the agent stated coldly, reading the Miranda rights as she hauled Monica back to her feet. I remained seated at the center of the elevated head table. I did not move. I simply watched the absolute destruction of their lives unfold before me. I watched the FBI agents drag Monica and Trevor through the grand ballroom, parading them past the 300 horrified guests. The flashing cameras that had greeted my arrival were now documenting their spectacular downfall. They had wanted a public spectacle to remove me from power. I had given them exactly what they asked for, but they were the ones wearing the chains. The audio recording finally ended, leaving a ringing, heavy silence in the wake of the screaming. Derek sat beside me, his entire body trembling violently. He was weeping openly, tears streaming down his face as he watched his wife being hauled out of the room by federal agents. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his eyes filled with a pathetic, desperate realization. He finally understood that he had lost everything. He had lost his wife, his fortune, his reputation, and the protection of his father. "Dad." Derek whimpered, his voice barely audible over the remaining murmurs of the crowd. "Dad, I am so sorry. I did not know she was going to poison you. I did not know about Trevor. Please, you have to believe me. You have to help me." I turned my head very slowly. I looked at the boy I had raised, the son I had given every advantage in the world. I looked at the man who had authorized the theft of $12 million and agreed to lock me in a psychiatric ward to save himself from his own cowardly mistakes. I reached out and picked up the red velvet box from the table. I snapped the lid shut with a sharp, definitive click. "I already told you, Derek," I said softly, my voice completely devoid of any remaining paternal affection. "The man who came into your office hoping for a misunderstanding is completely dead. You made your choice. You chose the dark. Now you get to live in it." I stood up from the table. I did not lean on my cane. I did not shuffle my feet. I walked away from my son, leaving him to face the ruins of his own life alone. The trap was finally closed. My corporate empire was safe again. The ballroom reached a deafening crescendo as agents secured their targets. Monica fought like a cornered animal. Her pristine crimson gown tore as she thrashed against the unyielding grip of the officers. She screamed my name, her voice cracking with rage and terror, demanding I call them off. I watched her, my expression devoid of pity. They dragged her toward the heavy oak doors, her diamond heels scraping across the polished marble floor. She was a venomous parasite finally being ripped away from her host. Across the room, Trevor fared no better. The moment the undercover agents revealed their tactical vests, his composure completely evaporated. He shoved a terrified waiter aside and made a sprint for the secondary service exit. It was a pathetic display of cowardice. 3 agents tackled him before he reached the threshold. The heavy thud of his body hitting the floor echoed clearly over the panicked murmurs of the guests. They pinned him down, securing his wrists with steel handcuffs. The mastermind who thought he could siphon $12 million from my empire was now just another common criminal whining as they hauled him away into the flashing blue and red lights of the Chicago night. With the architects of my chemical execution removed, the room began to quiet down. The remaining guests who had gathered to witness my supposed mental decline stood in stunned silence. They parted like the sea as I turned away from the exit and looked down. Derek was on the floor, trembling next to the overturned chair. His cowardice was absolutely wretched to behold. He raised his head, his face stained with tears. He crawled forward on his knees until looking up at me with wide, desperate eyes. He reached out his trembling hands, hovering just inches from my polished shoes, too afraid to touch me. "Dad, please," Derek sobbed, his voice choking on his own panic. "You have to understand. You have to believe me." I had no choice. Monica had a video, Dad. She had footage of the accident, the pedestrian, the hit and run. She told me she would send it to the police if I did not sign the transfer forms. She was blackmailing me. She held prison over my head. I was terrified. I only did what she asked to protect my life. I never wanted them to hurt you. Please, Dad, you have to save me. I stared down at the boy I had raised. I looked at the son I had nurtured, educated, and prepared to inherit an empire. I felt nothing but a freezing emptiness. The paternal bond that once anchored my world had been severed completely. You were blackmailed because you committed a crime, Derek, I stated, my voice ringing out with clear precision across the silent ballroom. You hit an innocent person, and you chose to run. You chose to hide like a coward rather than face the consequences. When the woman you married used your cowardice against you, you did not come to me for help. You did not confess. You chose to let her poison me. You chose to sign away my entire legacy. You chose to let them lock me in a psychiatric ward for the rest of my days to save yourself. Derek clamped his hands over his ears and let out a broken wail. You sold my life to save your own skin, I continued, my words landing like blows. You are no son of mine. I pulled a folded document from the inner pocket of my tuxedo jacket and dropped it directly in front of his trembling knees. That is your official termination notice, I explained coldly. You are fired from the company effective immediately. Bradley has already executed the legal amendments to disinherit you from the estate. You will not receive a single penny. Finally, I have handed the audio files containing your full confession directly to the authorities. They are waiting for you outside. You are left with nothing but your gambling debts and a pending prison sentence. I suggest you stand up and face them like a man. I turned my back on him. I did not watch as the officers moved in to place him in handcuffs. I simply walked away, my stride firm and unbroken, leaving the ruins of my family behind me. 5 months passed since the night of the gala. The bitter winter eventually thawed, making way for the vibrant warmth of spring. I stood out on the glass balcony of my corporate office, looking out over the city skyline. The warm morning sun reflected brilliantly off the skyscrapers. I took a deep, unrestricted breath of the crisp air, feeling vibrant, healthy, and profoundly alive. The chemical fog that clouded my mind for months was completely gone, replaced by mental clarity. I had stabilized the company, navigating the public scandal with absolute transparency. To ensure the future of the empire, I handed the daily operations over to a trusted board of directors, retaining only my position as visionary. I no longer needed to micromanage the ledgers. My focus had shifted to a much greater purpose. Using a portion of my recovered wealth, I established a foundation dedicated exclusively to protecting elderly individuals from severe financial and emotional abuse. We hired the most aggressive legal teams, skilled private investigators, and top-tier medical professionals to advocate for those who could no longer defend themselves against predatory family members. The foundation became my true legacy, a shield for the vulnerable born directly from the ashes of my own survival. Standing there in the sunlight, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The sorrow of losing my son had faded, replaced by the stoic understanding of necessity. Sometimes the deepest act of self-love is taking a scalpel to your own family tree, cutting off the rotting branches so the roots can finally breathe. I had removed the poison from my life, and in doing so I had truly saved myself. Blood does not guarantee loyalty, and love must never become a shield for abuse. Protecting yourself from toxic family members is not a cruel act. It is absolute survival. Tell us about a time you established boundaries with difficult relatives. Share your brave story in the comments below right now.